Good morning. Welcome to our attempt at doing sort of a new and different version of Sunday school study time. I will be attaching a hard copy of all that I'm talking about to the comments, along with a link to our Zoom if you'd like to join for an interactive time Sundays at 4 p.m. And I'll mention that again at the end of the study. Well, for the next 5 Sundays, that would be September 13th through October 11th, the gospel is going to consist of Jesus telling a parable to his followers. So I thought it would be a good idea for our Sunday school time to be centered around what parables are, the different types of parables that Jesus tells us, and what they could mean for us and our lives. So to begin, I want to do just kind of an opening activity, and I would like you to think about a scar that you have. And then tell yourself the story of how you got that scar. If there are others around you, you can tell your stories to one another as well. And ask yourself, does this story involve an accident or a surgery, a bad decision, an illness, or some combination of several various reasons? To give you an example, it's going to be hard to see in the camera, but I have a small scar here on my wrist. I don't really remember much about getting that scar. I was only about 2.5 years old. But the story that I was told by my mother and my brother is that we were walking from our house to a recycling center. My brother was pulling a wagon full of glass bottles and jars, and I wanted to help. And he was teasing me about being too weak and too small. And so, being stubborn and prideful, I picked up the largest glass bottle that I could get my hands around and started to carry it until I tripped on a crack on the sidewalk, dropped the bottle, and then landed on top of it. Thankfully, only cutting a very small portion of my wrist. But it reminds me when I see the scar that sometimes I can be stubborn and prideful, and then also that I don't want or like people to tell me what I'm capable of. So you get that kind of idea of what we're looking for in the story. And just take some time and enjoy remembering because we learn about ourselves and others through the stories. Very often, we don't see one another's scars. And so when we tell the stories, we hear another part of who we are and perhaps things that we did when we were younger or had happened to us. Stories are meant to inform us and shape us and teach us. They are funny or sad or silly or serious. And Jesus uses this form of story, this parable that we'll talk about in a moment, for all those things. They contain the ridiculous and the serious and the sad and the funny, and they are meant to teach us and inform us more about who we are and some of the ways that we behave and some of the ways that we shouldn't behave. But he opens up this realm of story to us. So parable. What is a parable? It's not a word we use much beyond church. And it really becomes a tough question to answer of what a parable is exactly. Neither the Hebrew or the Greek use this word in a very clear way. So, for instance, in Hebrew, the word that is used to define parable also gets used to define all types of figurative language, so comparisons and riddles and proverbs. Just about anything you could think of kind of gets this term parable. Whereas the Greek comes along and uses the word that sounds like parable, and it literally means to throw beside, which doesn't really make any sense. What is a throw beside? But when we get to one of the most accepted definitions, we kind of see how that works into the story. So the most accepted definition is that a parable is a story drawn from real life, things that we know, that makes a point in an indirect or somewhat unbelievable way. So it is taking something we know and throwing beside it something that seems unheard of or unusual. They are designed to leave us wanting more from the story. No parable ends with the words happily ever after, or the moral of the story is. They want us to think more upon them. And also, a parable desires us to place ourselves into the story in various roles. While we may gravitate towards a specific character, it is designed that we see ourselves in all of the people within the story. So this week's parable, which we'll get to in a moment, falls into a category known as parables of reversal. In other words, the parable goes along a path and we think we know where it is going to go, but it changes course on us. It reverses our expectation of what will happen. So some parables that you would know of that are parables of reversal, besides the one we'll hear today, are the Good Samaritan, right? We think we know who will stop and help, but we are surprised. The wedding banquet, right? People are invited. For some odd reason, they don't come. So the host goes out and collects whoever he can, and things we don't expect happen. And we will hear that parable on October 11th. The rich man and Lazarus, right? On the earth, the rich man has all the good things. Lazarus has all the bad things. And we expect that to be the case until death. Their roles are reversed. And then finally, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two people go into the synagogue. The Pharisee, the leader of the church, the tax collector, the hated of the people, and they both go in and pray, and we expect that the leader of the church's prayer will be the right one. And instead, we hear that the tax collector's prayer is the one that is truer and what God would like to hear more from us. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're going with today. Our parable for today is the parable of the unforgiving servant. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, the 18th chapter, verses 21 to 35. I do include it in the hard copy of the lesson in the link below, so you can find it there, or of course in the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to read through it just so you can hear it first, and then we'll talk about it in a moment. So the Gospel of Matthew, the 18th chapter. Then Peter came and said to Jesus, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But the same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you have not had mercy on your fellow slave, as I have mercy on you?' And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." So we know the parable begins often, as Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to. um, so what I want you to do is not only hear this parable, this passage, but I want you to read the passage. And I ask you to read it not 77 times, but 7 times. Yes, 7 times. Because I want you to hear it, to read it, to be a part of it in the following 7 ways. So the first time through, I'd ask you to be Peter. Put yourself in the position of asking Jesus how many times you should forgive, and then hearing the answer he relates to you. The second time through, I want you to put yourself in the place of the king, what it means to be the forgiving one, and yet then to feel like you have been betrayed and all of that. The third time through, I want you to be the first slave that owes the 10,000 talents. Now, before you put yourself in that position, I want you to understand, here comes the unbelievable part of the parable, which we may not understand because of the way money worked then and what money works now. But to give you a comparison, that slave owes roughly today the equivalent of $3 trillion. More than could ever be paid. Right? He says to the king, be patient with me, I will pay you back. There is no earthly way that slave could pay $3 trillion. That's the kind of debt he is in. It is a ridiculous amount. It is unbelievable. And it is, again, equally unbelievable that the king would just turn around and say, you know what, forget it. Who needs $3 trillion? Okay, so put yourself in that position. You know there is nothing you could possibly do to pay off that debt, even if your wife, your children, and all of your possessions were sold. But that's what we're talking about within this parable. We understand owing somebody something, but not to that extent. Okay, so once you've done that, go back through a 4th time and put yourself in the position of the slave that owed less. Now, to give you some context for that, what that slave owes is roughly $5,500, right? $5,500. Again, a huge amount for an individual to owe. But comparatively to $3 trillion, it is nothing. And yet the slave cannot forgive the other one who owes him the debt. Okay, so that gives you kind of the comparison of the believable and the unbelievable. 5th time through, put yourself in the position of the fellow slaves. These are the ones who are observing the story, who know that a slave has just been forgiven $3 trillion, and yet harasses and abuses one who owes him $5,500. And what they would say to their king and how they would expect that to play out. 6th time through, I want you to be the listeners to the parable. Peter's not the only one hearing this story. What would it mean for you to hear Jesus speaking this to his disciples, but also to you? And what perspective does that give you on forgiveness? And then finally, the 7th time through, I want you to put yourself in the place of Jesus. What do you think Peter is actually asking of you? Right? Why does someone come up and say to you, how many times should we forgive somebody? Right? And then what is Jesus' response to that? And why this particular parable? What does he hope to get across? And it can be many, many, many things. And then also, what changes about the story from the different angles? Right? Why do we get these different characters within there? And then, just out of curiosity, is there one person you most enjoyed being? And was there one person you least enjoyed being? And why? Stories give us insights as to who we are, how we might respond in the same situations, and what that means for us and about us. So that'll probably take some time. But once you're done with that, I want you to have some fun with the parable. I enjoy creative and wild activities, and I know all of us have some sort of creativity that we cling to and enjoy trying new things with. So I have just a couple of examples, but please feel free to do whatever speaks to you, reaches out to you. So, for instance, is there a way to tell this parable in the form of a knock-knock joke? Or just some type of joke? Jokes can be longer, but some way to make this funny. And then I know a lot of our, especially our younger people, know how to tweet and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. If you had to limit the story to a tweet, 280 words or less, or a post, what might you say? What would you highlight and how would you put that in there? Perhaps you like to draw comic strips and try to put it into that kind of perspective, or paint, or draw a picture that kind of encompasses what's happening. You could make a board game, some way that you find a different medium to tell this parable. And maybe you are really good with clay or Play-Doh or something like that, sculpture. Just have some fun and imagine how you might condense this parable to a particular meaning. There are going to be several different ways you can take the story, but have some fun with it. Finally, if you have some extra time and you want to look at the rest of the lessons for this coming Sunday, I'm going to include the passages in the hard copy, but also just I will let you know what they are, but it's always interesting. One of the things the church has done many years ago was something called the Revised Common Lectionary. And you may notice we have 3 years in that lectionary: the year of Matthew, which is this year, year A, the year of Mark, which is year B, the year of Luke, which is year C, and then the Gospel of John gets pushed into those 3 years in different places. And one of the things that happened is with each gospel, they pick an Old Testament, a Psalm, and a epistle or New Testament beyond the gospel reading to go with it. And so, in a way, this Revised Common Lectionary sort of chooses a theme for us to look at that Sunday. And so sometimes they fit in really well with the gospel. Sometimes they try to take one part of the gospel and attach to it. So needless to say, this week they picked the theme of forgiveness and try to find other passages that go along with that. So it just so happens the one they have paired with this particular gospel, the Old Testament reading comes from Genesis, the 50th chapter, verses 15 to 21. And it is the story, it's after all of the story of Joseph and the many-colored coat has happened. Joseph's whole family, Jacob and all his brothers, have moved to Egypt to live with him. And this part of the Old Testament reading picks up after Jacob, who is Joseph and the 12 brothers' father, has died. And the brothers are now concerned that Joseph hasn't truly forgiven them and will take out his anger and wrath upon them because they no longer have their father's protection. But the reading tells us how Joseph once again forgives his brothers against the sins they committed years before. So that's the Old Testament about, again, a second attempt at forgiveness. Probably more than that. I'm sure Joseph was quite angry with his brothers for a long time for their behavior. Our psalm for this Sunday is Psalm 103, the first 13 verses. And it is a psalm of thanksgiving, praising how great God's love and forgiveness and compassion are for his people. And then our New Testament reading happens to be Romans 14, 1 to 12. And Paul is talking about how judgment for whether people are good or bad rests in the hands of the Lord. And it contains the verse that gets read fairly often at funerals. That is, whether we live to the Lord or whether we die to the Lord, we are the Lord's. And so part of it will sound familiar, but it's also Paul kind of giving an idea to the church in Rome that we can't sit in judgment of one another because we all serve God. And so that's the passage for that. So I encourage you to read the rest of the lessons and see how you think they are used to tie into this gospel parable. A reminder again, on Sunday at 4 p.m., I will be on our Zoom channel. I will attach the link to that. If you would like to join me, I'd like to hear some of your SCAR stories, if you've done any of the other activities, and we'll talk some more about the lessons and any questions or other thoughts you'd have. So I look forward to doing this. Every week I'll try to get the lesson put out on Thursday so you have some time to look at it ahead of time. And then Sundays we will meet at 4 p.m. on Zoom for anyone who would like to join. Thank you so much, and we'll hopefully see you on Sunday. Have a great day.